There's a whole genre of games that takes non-stop action, explosions, and chaos to the extreme. We're talking about shoot-'em-ups, shmups, and run-and-gun games that don't hold back. We are talking about games packed with relentless enemies, intense firepower, and some of the most brutal and gory action you can find in gaming. From bullet storms that test your reflexes to over-the-top violence that pushes the limits, these games have built a dedicated following over the decades. In this video, we'll explore the top 15 most brutal and gory shmups and run-and-gun games, diving into what makes them unforgettable, why fans love them, and the moments that keep players coming back for more adrenaline-fueled chaos. Get ready to relive some of the wildest action gaming has ever seen.
You're busted! You're busted! Please! Please!
Narc wasn't just another run and gun when it came out. Instead, it was a full-on assault of violence and over-the-top excess. Developed by Williams, the same studio that would later bring us Mortal Kombat, this game pushed the limits of what you could get away with in a public arcade. The premise was simple. You play as Max Force or Hitman, futuristic law enforcers, on a mission to wipe out drug dealers, junkies, and kingpins across a seedy urban sprawl. The game wasn't infamous because of its story, but rather because of the sheer brutality of its unfolding events. Armed with machine guns and rocket launchers, players could mow down hordes of enemies in a spray of bullets, with blood, body parts, and explosions filling the screen. While many arcade shooters of the time opted for cartoonish or toned-down violence, Narc leaned into shocking realism, showing addicts in rags, snarling dogs, and enemies torn apart by rockets. It wasn't uncommon to see entire groups vaporized in a single explosion, leaving nothing but carnage behind. The controversy was immediate. While some praised it for its edgy, anti-drug message, others condemned it for glorifying violence. Despite the backlash, it became a cult hit and paved the way for the rise of more extreme arcade titles in the 90s. Contra. If you grew up in the late 80s, Contra was more than just a game. It was a rite of passage. Released in arcades in 1987 and soon after on the NES, Konami's classic run-and-gun shooter appeared to be just another action title on the surface. But once you started playing, you knew this was different. Contra didn't hold your hand when it came to violence. It threw you into bullet hell with nothing but quick reflexes and pure grit keeping you alive. You play as Commandos Bill Riser and Lance Bean, blasting through jungles, bases, and alien strongholds. The gameplay was tight, fast, and unforgiving, with enemies swarming from every angle. Contra's edge wasn't buckets of blood like the later games, but the sheer relentlessness of its violence. Explosions shredded soldiers into nothing, alien creatures erupted from pods, and bosses filled the screen with chaotic destruction. Every stage ended in the complete annihilation of whatever stood in your way. The NES port made the game iconic, especially with the famous Konami code: up, down, down, left, right, B, A, start, which granted 30 lives to desperate players. Without it, Contra's brutality could feel impossible to beat for non-veteran players. Contra is not the goriest game on this list, but it earns its spot for teaching an entire generation that games could be raw, merciless, and utterly addictive. It acted as a true foundation for violent shooters that came after it. Contra 3. The Alien Wars. The success of the first game made the Contra series a staple choice for fans of run-and-gun shooters. By 1992, Konami was no longer holding back. Contra 3, The Alien Wars, landed on the Super Nintendo and cranked the chaos up to 11. Where the original Contra hinted at brutality, this one went all in on large-scale destruction, alien horror, and relentless action that pushed the SNES hardware to its limits. Bill and Lance faced off against a full-blown alien invasion, tearing through a futuristic city. From the very first stage, you're dodging collapsing highways, blasting mutant dogs to pieces, and blowing up tanks that roll over anything in sight. The game's weapon variety included guns, flamethrowers, and homing missiles, ensuring the screen was constantly filled with carnage. What really set Contra 3 apart was its unapologetic spectacle. Bosses were gruesome alien monstrosities that filled half the screen, from massive insectoid creatures to biomechanical nightmares. The animations of enemies exploding into fiery chunks or dissolving into goo gave the game a visceral edge most console players hadn't seen before. Despite Nintendo's family-friendly image at the time, Contra 3 slipped through the cracks with all of its intensity intact. It was punishingly difficult, but that just fueled its legend. Midnight Resistance. Data East's Midnight Resistance stormed into arcades in 1989 with a premise that felt ripped from every gritty 80s action flick. You play as a hardened commando on a mission to rescue your kidnapped family from a ruthless criminal cartel, and the game wastes no time throwing you into a gauntlet of bullets, explosions, and bloodshed. The core hook was its unique rotary joystick, which allowed players to aim their guns in 8 directions while running. This made firefights feel chaotic and cinematic as enemies swarmed from all sides and players spun around, spraying hot lead in every direction. It was frantic, violent, and loud. An arcade shooter that made you feel like you were wading through non-stop urban warfare. Weapons played a significant role in the spectacle. Rocket launchers, flamethrowers, shotguns, and even homing missiles could be collected between stages. Each one delivered a satisfying punch, reducing enemy soldiers, turrets, and vehicles into fiery debris. The flamethrower in particular stood out, engulfing groups of enemies in pixelated fire that was shocking for the time. Though less infamous than Contra or Narc, Midnight Resistance built its cult following thanks to its over-the-top action and unapologetic violence. It even ported to home consoles like the Sega Genesis, where the carnage was toned down but still impressive. Metal Slug. Metal Slug might have looked cartoonish at first glance, but behind its hand-drawn charm lies one of the most violent and gory run-and-gun franchises ever created. Dropped in 1996 on the Neo Geo, the game stood out immediately for its fluid animations, chaotic action, and surprisingly gruesome details hiding under the humour. Players take control of Marco Rossi and Tama Roving, members of the Peregrine Falcon squad, tasked with taking down a rogue army. While the premise sounds standard, the execution was anything but. Soldiers screamed, bled, and sometimes burst into flames before dying when shot. Toss a grenade, and you'd see enemies blown to pieces with exaggerated, messy explosions. Captured hostages coughed, limped, and reacted like real people when freed, adding an eerie layer of humanity to the otherwise cartoon violence. Even the humour leaned into its brutality. Enemies would beg for mercy, only to be gunned down seconds later, or mutate weirdly into monsters before dying in hideous ways. Despite its arcade-friendly visuals, Metal Slug was unapologetically graphic. So much so that later entries in the series amped up the gore with zombie transformations, blood geysers, and enemies vomiting acid. Beneath its colourful surface, this was pure chaos, cementing Metal Slug as both hilarious and horrifying. Shock Troopers. If Metal Slug was SNK's stylish, cartoonishly violent showpiece, Shock Troopers was its raw, no-nonsense cousin. The game didn't hold back on the body count when it came to violence. This top-down run-and-gun puts you in the boots of a mercenary squad tasked with stopping the evil Bloody Scorpion organization. What sounds like a cliché action plot quickly spiraled into one of the most frantic and blood-soaked arcade experiences of its time. Unlike other side-scrollers, Shock Troopers let players move freely in 8 directions, dodging waves of bullets while unloading machine guns, flamethrowers, and explosives on enemy troops. The carnage was relentless as the soldiers burst into flames and vehicles exploded into fiery debris when shot at. Bosses were often gruesome military experiments that went down in over-the-top showers of gore. The flamethrower in particular made an impression, setting entire squads ablaze and leaving charred corpses in its wake. One of the game's most brutal twists was its branching path system. Depending on your choices, you'd storm jungles, mountains, or urban death traps, each packed with ambushes and environmental hazards that made the violence feel dynamic and unpredictable. Every route was drenched in chaos, ensuring no two runs felt the same. It was a run and gun that didn't care about subtlety. It only cared about giving you every excuse to blow enemies to pieces. Forgotten Worlds. Capcom's Forgotten Worlds hit arcades in 1988 and immediately stood out for its bizarre mix of sci-fi fantasy, relentless action, and unapologetic brutality. You control one of two cybernetically enhanced Nameless Ones, warriors resurrected to fight against an evil god known as Bios. It may sound like standard arcade lore, but once you drop into its wasteland setting, the carnage begins. The game's unique control scheme allows players to rotate their characters independently of their movement, meaning they can fly across the screen while blasting in all directions. This design turned firefights into a constant storm of bullets, lasers, and explosions, shredding everything in sight. Enemies didn't simply vanish, they disintegrated into rubble, burned to ashes, or were torn apart in bursts of pixel violence. Even the alien creatures and monstrous bosses went down in spectacular, almost gory animations that shocked arcade goers at the time. Post-apocalyptic cities and crumbling ruins served as backdrops, while players scorched through hordes of mutants, robots, and human soldiers alike. The violence was woven into the very identity of the game. Add in devastating weapons like flamethrowers and massive energy cannons, and the destruction reached near-apocalyptic levels. Though overshadowed by Capcom's bigger franchises later on, Forgotten Worlds deserves its place as one of the most brutal arcade shooters of the late 80s. A forgotten gem that reveled in stylish, over-the-top devastation. Alien Soldier. By 1995, Sega's Mega Drive had already built a reputation for pushing action to extremes, but Alien Soldier from Treasure took that reputation and cranked it to a fever pitch. Known for their inventive, high-octane games, such as Gunstar Heroes, Treasure designed Alien Soldier as a brutal test of reflexes, skill, and sheer endurance. Step into the role of Epsilon Eagle, a genetically engineered super soldier betrayed by his own organisation. From the opening moments, the game is a blur of bullets, explosions, and gross alien monstrosities. Almost every encounter is a boss fight, with enemies that mutate, explode, and thrash across the screen in ways that felt both stylish and unsettling. Defeating them usually meant watching pixelated gore as they ripped apart or dissolved under relentless firepower. Alien Soldier was especially notorious for its punishing difficulty. This wasn't a game designed for casual players as it demanded absolute precision. Epsilon Eagle's arsenal included rapid-fire guns, devastating energy blasts, and a flashy Phoenix Force attack that literally transformed him into a burning projectile, tearing through bosses with explosive results. Combined with the game's hyper-detailed sprites and fast-paced animation, the carnage never stopped. Super C. Super Contra. Super Contra was the second game in the Contra series, a sequel to Contra. If you think that the original Contra felt brutal, its sequel, Super C, dialed everything up a notch. It dropped players right back into a war zone, only this time the action was meaner, faster, and packed with even more alien horrors. Konami clearly wanted to outdo themselves, and they succeeded with one of the most punishing and violent run and guns of the decade. Commandos Bill and Lance, once again, gunning through military bases and alien nests. The violence was relentless. Explosions sent soldiers flying, flamethrowers cooked enemies alive, and alien bosses erupted into showers of goo when defeated. The arcade version leaned especially hard into spectacle, with bigger sprites and far more gruesome death animations than the first games. When Super C hit the NES, Nintendo's stricter censorship meant blood was toned down, but the sheer difficulty and non-stop destruction carried over. Players were swarmed by enemy troops, turrets, and alien parasites, leaving little room for error. Each level felt like a gauntlet designed to punish hesitation, and boss fights often filled the entire screen with death. For fans of brutal shooters, Super C was where Contra truly earned its reputation. Zombie Nation. Some NES games were weird, but Zombie Nation took bizarre and turned it into one of the most violent, chaotic shooters on the console. Released in 1990 by Meldak, this cult classic put you in control of a massive disembodied samurai head named Namakubi, who floats across America to rescue it from an alien parasite that has turned humans into zombies. The setup alone is wild, but the gameplay is pure destruction. Instead of shooting bullets, Namakubi spits streams of energy and vomits out eyeballs to annihilate enemies. Buildings crumble to the ground as you blast them apart. Bridges collapse, and hordes of zombified humans explode into debris. For a Nintendo game, the amount of chaos and implied gore was shocking. The brutality wasn't subtle, and that's exactly why it stands out. Most NES shooters played it safe, with aliens or robots taking the brunt of your attacks, but Zombie Nation had you literally leveling American cities and wiping out infected civilians. It felt outrageous, anarchic, and far darker than its colourful 8-bit graphics suggested. Critics at the time were baffled, but players who found it loved the absurd mix of violence and strangeness. Today, Zombie Nation is remembered as one of the weirdest and most violent NES titles ever made. Gunstar Heroes. At first glance, Gunstar Heroes appears colourful and cartoony, but beneath the playful art style lies a game brimming with chaos, violence, and non-stop destruction. Unlike slower-paced shooters, this one hurled you into the action from the very first screen and never let up. It quickly became one of the most talked-about run-and-guns of the 16-bit era. Players controlled the Gunstar twins, Red and Blue, battling against the Empire, who sought to harness powerful gems to unleash devastation. The violence came through, not in gore, but in sheer spectacle. Like some of the other games on this list, the weapon system lets you combine guns into devastating hybrids, creating flamethrowers, homing lasers, or screen-filling chaos that vaporizes anything unlucky enough to get caught in your line of fire. The boss fights are where Gunstar Heroes really flexed its brutality. Giant machines broke apart piece by piece under heavy fire, creepy transformations filled the screen, and enemies unleashed patterns of destruction that tested every reflex. It wasn't bloody, but it felt overwhelming in its intensity. Though not censored like other violent titles of the era, Gunstar Heroes carried the same spirit of anarchic destruction that defined the genre.
Me in deep big trouble.
Sunset Riders. Konami's Sunset Riders hit arcades in 1991 and proved that the Wild West could be just as brutal as any sci-fi warzone. Beneath its bright, cartoonish art style was a run-and-gun dripping with non-stop shootouts, explosions, and more than a little bloodshed, especially in the uncensored versions. Players picked from 4 bounty hunters, Steve, Billy, Bob, and Cormano, each bringing their own flair to the carnage. The mission was simple: hunt down wanted criminals and collect bounties. On the way, you'd mow down waves of outlaws, torch saloons, and ride stampeding horses while blasting enemies off rooftops. The sheer volume of bullets on screen turned every level into a chaotic bloodbath. In the Japanese and arcade versions, enemies even coughed up blood when shot, something toned down in later console ports. Bosses of the game were called outlaws. Each outlaw had their own over-the-top death scene, from being riddled with bullets to getting blown apart in fiery explosions. Combined with fast-paced music and rowdy voice samples, Sunset Riders felt like a kid's morning cartoon gone wild. Despite the violence, it had a goofy charm, as Cormano's pink outfit and comical animations gave players laughs even as bodies piled up. It became a cult hit, remembered as both light-hearted and surprisingly raw in its depiction of Wild West carnage. Biohazard Battle. Biohazard Battle might not be the first game that comes to mind when talking about Sega's Mega Drive shooters, but it stands out as one of the grimmest and most unsettling. The game felt like a bioorganic nightmare. Every enemy, background, and even your own craft was designed to resemble a mutated organism, creating a disturbing, almost suffocating atmosphere. The story sets the tone. Humanity has fled a dying planet, only to return centuries later and find it overrun with mutant life created by a biological catastrophe. You pilot a living bioship, which is a flying creature armed with organic weaponry. The mission is to clear a path through this twisted ecosystem. Instead of robots or aliens, you face swarms of pulsating worms, spiked tentacle beasts, and nightmarish flying insects that seem ripped straight out of a horror movie. Enemies explode into fleshy bits, and the oppressive, toxic backgrounds, which are filled with veins, spores, and parasitic growths, make every level feel like you're flying inside a diseased body. The soundtrack only amplifies the tension, a mix of eerie and harsh synths that hammer in the sense of dread. Even though it failed to become a mainstream hit, Biohazard Battle earned a cult following for its grotesque designs and suffocating mood. It showed how the Mega Drive could push violent, unsettling imagery without a drop of traditional gore, instead horrifying players with atmosphere and body horror. Heavy Barrel was yet another masterpiece of the developers at Data East Studio. The premise of the game was simple. Terrorists have taken over a nuclear missile site, and it's up to you and a buddy, if you're playing co-op, to blast your way through legions of enemies to stop them. Heavy Barrel stood out because of the sheer body count and destruction left in your wake as you move on with your mission. The game's big hook is the titular Heavy Barrel, a devastating energy weapon that you assemble by collecting 6 scattered pieces. Once put together, this cannon vaporizes entire screens of soldiers, tanks, and turrets in seconds, leaving nothing but smoldering wreckage behind. Even without it, the action is relentless, with grenades and rifles shredding enemy squads in close quarters as explosions fill the screen. Graphically, it was a step up in grit compared to its contemporaries. The overwhelming amount of carnage gave the game an almost war crime vibe by modern standards. Arcade cabinets with rotary joysticks allowed for precision aiming, adding to the frantic sense of mowing down dozens at once. Heavy Barrel may not get as much recognition today, but it was one of the purest examples of over-the-top 80s arcade violence. Rolling Thunder 2. Namco's Rolling Thunder 2 was a slick evolution of the spy action formula introduced in the original. Still, it also cranked up the violence in ways that pushed its James Bond-style aesthetic into something much darker. You play as either Albatross or Layla, members of the Rolling Thunder Task Force, battling against a sinister terrorist network known as Geldra. The tropical settings, futuristic bases, and neon-soaked backdrops give it a stylish veneer, but underneath it all is a game about ruthlessly dismantling an army of masked killers. Rolling Thunder 2 was slower and a more methodical game, demanding precision where every bullet counted, and enemies came at you in disciplined waves. The violence carried more weight because of it. One wrong move could leave you overwhelmed by machine gun fire or swarmed by mutant-like assassins. Hidden doors provided ammo or weapons, but also the tension of never knowing if enemies were lurking inside. The protagonist wildest was depicted as a rather fragile character, dying only with 1 or 2 hits, making the gameplay even more brutal. On Genesis, the port retained this unforgiving brutality while adding slightly brighter visuals, but the tone stayed the same. The characters collapsed in grim animations. Rolling Thunder 2 might not shower the screen with gore like some of its peers, but its cold, unrelenting cycle of death made it feel just as violent and merciless as the bloodiest run-and-gun classics. Marvellous verdict! After blasting through this lineup, one thing's crystal clear: the world of shmups and run-and-gun shooters was never just about fast reflexes and high scores. These games thrived on raw chaos, ruthless difficulty, and an unapologetic sense of violence that pushed the limits of what arcade cabinets and consoles could tolerate. Whether it was the body count in Narc, the alien dismemberment in Contra 3, or the gritty mercenary mayhem of Metal Slug, each of these titles carved out its own brutal legacy. It was wild how these games balanced all that carnage with personality. Some went over the top and cartoonish, while others leaned into grim realism or sci-fi horror. Still, all of them gave players that same pulse-pounding satisfaction of mowing down enemies with overwhelming firepower. They may not have had realistic blood physics or modern 3D graphics, but the intensity they delivered is still hard to match. These classic games weren't afraid to shock, challenge, and sometimes even disturb their players, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the violent shooters we still play today. Which of these brutal shooters scarred your childhood the most? Or maybe there's a hidden gem we missed that deserves to be on this list? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe for more exploration dives into gaming's wild history.